Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Let's get to our top story tonight. Last Friday, the United States sanctioned Chinese and Russian companies that Washington said had supported the development of Iran's missile program. The four firms accused of transferring sensitive technology and items to Iran's missile program will be subject to restrictions on U.S. government aid and on their exports for 2 years. This was announced by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in a statement. The companies include Chinese-based Chengdu Best New Materials and Zebu LM Trade, as well as Russia-based Nilco Group and joint stock company Elcon. We will continue, and this is a statement that Pompeo made, so this is verbatim from what he said. We will continue to work to impede Iran's missile development efforts and use our sanctions authorities to spotlight the foreign suppliers, such as these entities in the PRC and Russia, that provide missile-related materials and technologies to Iran. To discuss further these actions by an outgoing administration, we are joined by Elizabeth Laris, professor and department chair of political science and international affairs at University of Mary, Washington, and Sean Rain, author and founder and managing director of the China Market Research Group. Let me begin with Professor Laris here. Professor Laris, we are witnessing what the outgoing administration is doing with reference to China as well as Iran. Are these measures being taken to sort of put pressure on the incoming administration that might have its more nuanced agenda as put out by President-elect Joe Biden in his March-April Foreign Affairs article this year?
The recent activity has been very consistent with the Trump administration's approach to Iran for the past, few years of his administration. President Trump pulled the United States out in 2018 from the 2015 nuclear Iran deal. And so this is the latest of actions that the Trump administration has taken after he took the United States out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The United States reimposed sanctions on Iran. And in August, the United States went to the UN over concern that the 5-year embargo on arms sales to Iran would be lifted in October of this year. And the Trump administration wanted that embargo to be extended. The UN Security Council refused to extend the embargo because they did not want to jeopardize the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And at that time, Secretary of State Pompeo said that the United States then would unilaterally impose what's called snapback sanctions. So when the UN Security Council, turned down the idea of extending the embargo, the Trump administration had a choice. It could act unilaterally, or it could seek to work with its European allies. But the European allies weren't for it. And so Trump acted unilaterally. So what we're seeing here now in November is after UN inspectors came back from Iran and said that Iran was enriching nuclear material beyond the caps of the 2015 agreement, the Trump administration said, we're going to reimpose sanctions on this regime and then, of course, impose the sanctions on the Chinese and Russian companies that are contributing to these projects in Iran. So it's actually very consistent rather than putting pressure on the next administration.
Right. Now, that's a great summation of the chronology of events. But here's my question. This JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that you referred to, was a UN Security Council resolution mandated multilateral agreement, as you know. And there was a lot of criticism of the Trump administration, also from allies that are also part of the agreement, with reference to the unilateral withdrawal that you referred to. Also, missile development is not strictly part of the JCPOA. Now, we know that when Trump walked out of this agreement unilaterally, he was basically referring to other benchmarks that were not strictly part of the original 2015 deal. Now, given that, what is your assessment? And President-elect Joe Biden has been talking about how he's going to approach this. So, given that contrast, what is your assessment of how the incoming administration is likely to view this?
The incoming administration, if you look at Vice President-elect Biden's background and then the cabinet picks that he's made so far, it's clear that they prefer multilateral action that is going to multilateral institutions such as the UN, WTO, WHO, for resolution of issues. And so I expect that you will see the next administration going back to the UN on this and in all likelihood rejoining the 2015 agreement. President Trump came in, he campaigned on, as we all know, the mantra of, making America great again and America first. So he did not hesitate to act unilaterally. And the United States has, in much of its past, acted unilaterally when it felt that multilateral institutions came up with decisions that were, just wrong for the United States. And so Trump said, we're going to move unilaterally on this because he believed that the 2015 deal was a bad deal. But I expect the next administration, again, because they are more multilateralists, to act within international organizations and act more with our allies.
Right. Stay with me, Professor Laris. Let me pull in Sean Rain here. Sean, the problem with walking out unilaterally from multilateral agreements is that the United States, of course, the most powerful state in the world, cannot have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that it cannot insist on having a rules-based order and then flout those very rules when it deems fit and considers them to be against its national interest. So give me your sense of these new sanctions and how you think the incoming administration is likely to refer to this matter.
I really blame Mike Pompeo on this. It's partially Trump, but I think Pompeo is trying to run a scorched earth policy. He understands he's got only 2 months left before he's going to be put down into the dustbin of history. He's not going to win the presidency in 2024. I don't think he's going to go back to Kansas and become a senator there. So he's trying to scorch the earth and cause as many problems for both the Biden administration as well as for Iran, China, and any country that Pompeo deems an enemy. And I think it's a real issue. Something that I think a lot of people don't talk about is how much radical evangelical Christianity is supporting Pompeo. And I want to be very clear. I'm a big believer in freedom of religion, and I support Christianity. But there's a certain strain of radical evangelical Christianity that Pompeo subscribes to, that Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, subscribes to, and some of the protesters or /rioters in Hong Kong. These people view mainland China as a communist country as an enemy. There's nothing that China can do to placate these people. And so I think what you're going to see is over the next day, weeks, months coming, Pompeo is going to keep attacking China in a very difficult manner. Just today, he launched more sanctions on CNOOC, one of China's oil companies. And I think he's doing this to hurt China, but also because he understands that President Xi is going to try to be moderate in his response. He's going to try to create good relations with Biden and isn't going to try to attack the United States back anytime soon, because he does want to forge good relations with Tony Blinken, the prospective next Secretary of State, who's viewed as a good guy out here. He's viewed as somebody that the Chinese government can work with and find common ground.
Right. Sean, given President Trump's sort of penchant for firing through tweets, in fact, his various advisors and his various, team members, what makes you say that Pompeo is kind of playing off his own bat when it comes to this?
Well, I think Pompeo is an ideologue, and I think right now Trump is just letting him do what he's doing while he's focused on trying to raise money. If you think about it, Trump has raised over 170 million US dollars since the end of the election. And he's raising this money, he says, to his supporters to be able to start the recount. But when you look at it, 75% of the money actually goes to one of his new super PACs that is going to be used for him for salaries and transportation costs that he's going to have. It's basically grifting, that he's going to have a little pouch of money that he's going to be able to spend for the next few years. He's focused on his own financial and political survival going forward. I don't think he really even knows where Iran or China is on the map. He's letting Pompeo run things.
Right. Very interesting. Let's take these thoughts to Professor Laris here. Professor Laris, Sean Rain is presenting an interesting picture of what he thinks is happening. Do you subscribe to that? Would you want to add or subtract something from it?
Well, I disagree. This is about Iran. Now, Iran is, in the U.S.'s view, the bugbear in the Middle East. And that is why you have seen, if I might call it shuttle diplomacy between Washington and the Gulf countries and other countries in the Middle East who are very nervous about Iran's increasing influence in the region. And lo and behold, the United States has been able to bring 2 and very possibly shortly 3 countries to the table to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And of course, Israel is very concerned, as are the other countries, about the rise of Iran. There has not been a major breakthrough in the Middle East peace process since Jordan recognized the right of Israel to exist back in 1991, and before that.
Professor Laris, let me interject here. I understand what you're saying with reference to how Israel looks at Iran or how some of the Arab Gulf countries look at Iran. But what we have actually seen is that it's Iran which has been under the most stringent sanctions, primary and secondary, known to mankind. It's Iran whose one of the generals was killed in a drone attack by the United States. It's Iran whose one nuclear scientist has just been assassinated 40 kilometers south of Tehran. So it seems to me that, it's not really Iran that's on the offensive. It's, other countries that perhaps consider Iran a threat who are on the offensive here.
Well, the question that I was answering was, is it about China? And so I was saying, no, this is more about Iran. And again, getting back to my initial point, that the United States has had antagonistic relations with Iran since the revolutionaries took the embassy in Tehran, the U.S. embassy in Tehran, in 1979. And there have been numerous efforts among the United States and its allies in the UN over the years to get Iran to play by the balls, play by the rules of the game, okay. And really haven't been very successful, but keep trying a lot of different efforts to do so.
Right. I will get back Iran once again to you, Professor Laris, but let me go back to Sean Rain. So, Sean, the professor is saying this is not really about China or Russia. It's about Iran. I seem to think that, this is one of those perhaps ideal situations for Mike Pompeo, as you described him, where he can, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I mean, there's China also, there's Iran also.
I think quite clearly he's going after Iran. They're definitely, I was in the Middle East quite a bit last year, and there are concerns from Iran's neighbors about Iran's increasing influence. But it's quite clear that Pompeo wants to contain and destabilize Iran and China. So it's basically with one stone, he's able to kill two birds with these types of sanctions. But I think it's important that we highlight that it's American aggression. I'm not really sure what Iran has done in the last 3 months. Now, I'm not saying that Iran's government is great. I'm not an expert in that. But I haven't seen an increase of rhetoric coming from the Iranian side. I've seen it all coming from the American side, just like we're seeing from the American side towards China. So it's quite clear that it's a scorched earth policy against Iran and China, trying to stop both countries. And I think it's quite clear that the economic sanctions on the Iranian people are a crime against humanity. I think 100 years, 200 years from now, Pompeo and his predecessors who put these types of sanctions that really impoverish generations of innocent Iranians are going to go down ugly in history. It's not right. If you're mad at the government, fine, but you can't penalize tens of millions of people.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ron Rain speaking with us. Let me go back to Professor Lares. Professor Lares, so focusing on Iran, what do you think has been the benefit, presumed or real, of President Trump's scorched earth policy on Iran? And are you looking forward to a more nuanced approach by President-elect Joe Biden? And do you think that that's going to better redound to the U.S. advantage?
There's a possibility that more of the Gulf states will cooperate with the Biden administration. Apparently Saudi Arabia was ready to make some positive overtures to Israel, but then when the results of the U.S. presidential election were thrown into question, apparently Saudi Arabia decided to wait until a new administration came in. So we might see more breakthroughs. As I indicated, the view in Washington and the view in the Middle East is that Iran is the most destabilizing force there, and that the countries need a coordinated effort to face Iran. For a while, it was pretty much just Israel, and the Arab countries refused to recognize the right of Israel to exist, so there wasn't going to be cooperation there. And so I think that we could see some real movement after January 20th, with the Biden administration going back to multilateral institutions. And then, because of the certainty of the U.S. elections are over, some more cooperation amongst the Gulf states and other states in the Middle East in a coordinated response to Iran.
Right. Stay with Professor Lares. I'm also joined by Mark Sleboda, who's an analyst for RT. Sleboda, thank you for being on the program. We were obviously discussing these new sanctions against 2 Chinese companies and 2 Russian companies for having allegedly provided, support and facilitated the Iranian missile program. Give me your thoughts on that before we move further.
I think, of course, it is entirely possible. Haven't heard about the particulars, that these companies are assisting the government of Iran with its missile and rocket program, which they are perfectly, under international law, now allowed to do with the expiration of the UN Security Council 1929 resolutions because of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Agreement. Those sanctions are removed. Iran has every right to develop their rocket and missile technology, as any country in the region, like, say, Israel does. Iran doesn't have a nuclear arsenal, and the Russian and Chinese governments dismiss these sanctions as yet another act of illegal economic warfare by the U.S. regime.
Right. That's an interesting thought. Let me take it to Professor Lares. Now, Professor Lares, technically what Mark Sleboda is saying makes sense because this is something which is within the ambit of international law. What Iran is doing, or the Chinese companies or the Russian companies, if they have assisted Iran, is perfectly in line with the JCPOA and also the lifting of the arms embargo. So how can the U.S. then justify these sanctions?
Well, because the U.S. can act in its own best interest, and the U.S. is saying that if these companies want to help Iran in various ways that they do, then the U.S. doesn't have to do business with them, and the U.S. doesn't have to play ball with them. So yeah, these companies can go ahead and, do business with Iran on their missile program and, other type programs, but they don't have to continue to do business with the United States then.
Right. So, Mark Sleboda, that's a very simple response to the point that you raised, that the U.S. is doing it in U.S.'s own interest. However, the issue is that if we extrapolate further from this argument, then we are going to have a somewhat anarchic world, in the sense that, multilateral agreements and what the UN says and so on and so forth, all will be reduced to the interests of a single state. For instance, the Russian Federation could start doing it, or the Chinese can start doing it, or anyone can. So that it will be extremely difficult to then refer to multilateral agreements and a rules-based order.
My colleague in the United States is aware, of course, that isn't strictly true. Economic sanctions are considered an economic form of warfare and aggression on international law, and without the remit of the UN Security Council, they are an illegal, aggressive act of a rogue regime. Which is, what we have repeatedly seen from the United States. And of course, it's not that these companies are actually doing or want to do business in the United States. It's the U.S. then pursuing secondary sanctions against any other companies or countries that will then work with these businesses. And U.S. has sanctioned so many countries in so many ways to try to use economic leverage to force political decisions in these countries in line with their own hegemonic geopolitical interests, that it's to the point of absurdity. Russia has suffered 46 rounds of sanctions just in the last 4 years from the Trump regime in the United States. Now, of course, that hasn't changed Russia's political behavior, either around the world or with its companies when it's in line with its own interests. But this is really not about actually doing anything. This is a political domestic act in the United States, a signal to its allies, a signal of impotence, really. The belief that the United States government has to do something to express its outrage against other countries in the world having independent foreign and military policies, and that shall we say, the political ruling class, the blob in the United States, feels that it must express that outrage, and sanctions are the chosen way of doing that, despite their rather bad record of doing anything, at least not what they're intended to do.
Right. Thank you. That's Mark Sleboda talking to us. Professor Lares, there's the issue of the primary sanctions, and then there's the issue of the secondary sanctions. Now, you might have read this, it appeared yesterday, a Wall Street Journal news report about Sri Lanka. And this is a thought across Asia that the secondary sanctions regimes have actually hit developing economies even when those states have not been sanctioned by the United States. Like, for instance, Pakistan can have, we are in need of gas and oil. Iran is our next door neighbor. We have not been able to, make use of that because of these secondary sanctions. And there are so many things that Pakistan can export to Iran and vice versa. That doesn't happen. So even though, the point I'm making is, even though Pakistan is not under sanctions, its economy still hurts because of the secondary sanctions imposed by the United States on Iran.
Yeah, sanctions are a powerful tool, and that's why they should not be used lightly, and that's why they are used when diplomacy has been exhausted. At some point, you can only jaw so much. And if nothing is happening, and of course, as you know, this has been a criticism that the United States has had of the UN, in that the UN is very much unable to enforce a lot of its own decisions. And so then the United States doesn't have a lot of confidence in multilateral institutions. And countries and leaders of countries do think of their countries first. And then if the jaw doesn't work, then the next resort is the sanctions.
No, but here's the point, Professor Laris. I'm happy you're talking about the jaw part of it. But I believe, and there was a lot of Sherpa work and chin wagging that went into stitching together this multilateral, joint comprehensive plan of action. And there was no real reason for the Trump administration to have walked out of it and increased the benchmarks, which were not part of the original JCPOA, and then go in for the most stringent primary and secondary sanctions regime. So I believe that the jaw had actually worked.
Well, UN inspectors were just there, last month, I think, mid-November, and said that Iran is exceeding the caps.
But remember, but hold on, Professor Laris. Iran was perfectly acknowledging the benchmarks placed in the JCPOA. It was following them to the letter and spirit. And when the United States walked out of the agreement, Iran kept saying to the European partners in the agreement that they need to do something about the sanctions waiver and the rest of it. Otherwise, Iran will begin to walk back from its commitment gradually, from its commitment to the JCPOA. So Iran has not made any secret of that. It's part of a very clearly announced policy by Iran.
Well, there were indications earlier that Iran was violating the terms of the agreement, and that was confirmed
not according to the IAEA report. But stay with me, Professor Laris. I'm also joined by George Zimuli, who's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Professor Zimuli, give me a sense of this whole sanctions business. And we were talking about Pompeo having sanctioned 2 Chinese and 2 Russian companies for helping and facilitating Iran's missile program. Now, the arms embargo is gone. The missile program, frankly, is not part of the original JCPOA. So what exactly are we looking at here?
Well, you have to keep in mind that sanctions, particularly unilateral sanctions, are really very questionable in international law. If we think of the laws of war, the laws of war say that you cannot inflict pain on civilian populations. But that's precisely what sanctions do. Now, there had been sanctions in place for a number of years, and those were sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council.
Correct.
Those sanctions were lifted upon the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. What the United States is now doing is clearly in violation of international law, and it's really just about inflicting as much pain and humiliation on Iran as possible. There doesn't seem to be any real rationale for it, other than the vague hope expressed quite frequently by President Trump, that Iran will at some point come back to the table and he will be able to get a better deal with Iran. Well, Iran hasn't come to the table. It's not likely to come to the table. And it's not going to sign an agreement that is worse than the JCPOA, particularly as Iran has no faith in the United States actually adhering even to that worse agreement, because whoever is the next president can easily walk away from that agreement. So the policy doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right. Stay with me, Professor Zimmerman. Let me go back to Professor Laris here. Professor Laris, that's the problem. You know, when you walk out of multilateral agreements, when there's no real reason for doing that, apart from some kind of, ideological, picture that you might have in your own head, which is what the Trump administration did, or perhaps President Trump himself did. So it becomes extremely difficult for the Iranian regime, even if President-elect Joe Biden wants to get back to the table to say, well, we are going to sit down and discuss this, because if 2024, if President Trump comes back, what happens then? He's going to walk out of it again.
I wouldn't overemphasize the ideological component here. Again, the United States has had a pretty consistent record of chilly relations with Iran since '79. This administration is not about multilateralism. And a lot of the American public elected President Trump in 2016 because they saw the failures of the Obama administration foreign policy. Pallets of money sent to Iran in the middle of the night in US dollars to seal the deal didn't go over well with the American public. And there was a lot of skepticism that Iran was upholding its end of the deal. And so, again, that said, with the new administration, I think that you will see things done very differently. And this administration, will say that we did what we thought was in the best interest of the United States. I am sure the Biden administration will say we're acting in the best interest of the United States, but our methods will be different.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth Laris, speaking with us. Professor Zimuli, it's interesting. Last time you were on my program, you talked about, and that was, of course, with reference to President-elect Joe Biden's likely approach to Russia. Now, Pompeo has sanctioned to Russian firms also. Is that because there's already this sort of sense in the United States that President Trump has been very close to Russia? I mean, I had Mark Sloboda earlier on the program, and he talked about 46 rounds of sanctions that Russia has been under. So what is likely to change, when President Biden takes over? I mean, it's been the same more or less under the Trump administration.
Well, I tend to think that it might get more belligerent under President Biden, because I think that there might be more serious confrontations with Russia in a variety of theaters. I think that the Biden administration will renew its plan to effect regime change in Syria. If it does do that, and this is something that the apparently incoming Secretary of State has promised to do, if the Bidens do that, then they will come into confrontation with Russia. The same thing would happen if the United States starts getting involved in the Caucasus, in the apparently still conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is another area where you could see an opportunity for a Biden administration. So I think that, and of course, there's Ukraine, which is Biden's particular bailiwick. This is something that he was very preoccupied with during the Obama years.
Absolutely.
So it's again quite likely that he'll get involved in Ukraine. So if you add all that together, I think the confrontations might get a little more serious than just simply sanctions.
Right. Thank you so much. That was George Zimuli speaking with us. We shall take a short break. and return to discuss farmers' protests in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about farmers' protests in India. Farmers are protesting against 3 agricultural laws and have blockaded some key highways. On Sunday, protesting farmers rejected an offer by the Indian government to hold immediate talks if they ended the blockade of key highways they have blocked in protest against those controversial laws. The farmers say the laws could cause the government to stop buying grain at guaranteed prices and result in their exploitation by corporations that would buy their crops cheaply. The government says the legislation brings about much-needed reforms that will give farmers the freedom to market their produce and boost production through private investment. To discuss this further, we have with us Professor Arun Kumar, an economist, Mr. Nishant Verma, who is a political analyst. Let me begin with Professor Kumar. Professor Kumar, this is a story of South Asia. Frankly, I mean, the small farmers especially feel they will get hit in the event that the corporate sector comes in and, if the government sort of withdraws the subsidies and the guaranteed purchase prices for the grains. So how is this going to pan out what do you think of which way this will sort of go?
You see, let us understand what the problem is. It's not that the government is saying we'll withdraw the marketing provision of what is called the APMC, or that we are going to not announce the minimum support prices that were announced, by the government. The government is saying that it will give the farmers choice and free up the market so that they can sell wherever they like. So in a sense, the government is saying we'll marketize the system of agriculture produce selling, and we'll introduce better markets into the system. But that is where the problem lies. The small farmers, and 86% are those who cultivate less than 2 hectares of land, and the average is less than 2 acres of land that is cultivated by the farmers. Now, these people do not have market power, and therefore, anytime markets are introduced, they are the ones who are losing out. That's what happened during Green Revolution also, if you remember, in the late 60s. That is the time when, a lot of capital got introduced into the agriculture system, and large number of farmers then became landless. So in the 1971 census, there were a lot of landless farmers. Their numbers increased dramatically. They became, workers rather than farmers. So what is feared by the farmers is that this is only a ploy to actually slowly whittle down the system of APMC, which gives some degree of assurance, and also to give them some amount of minimum support price. And the problem in agriculture really is that agriculture markets are not like the non-agricultural markets, the industrial markets, etc., where businesses have some monopoly power and they can fix the price. Because there are millions upon millions of, rather than hundreds of millions of farmers, nobody has a monopoly, so they can't fix their own price. They depend on the monsoon, they depend on various factors, and that's why they remain poor. They are borrowers of capital from the money lenders, from the traders, and they get exploited as a result. Minimum support price gives them some degree of assurance, even though a lot of the farmers do not receive the minimum support price, and not all crops are covered by the minimum support price mechanism, but it gives certain degree of assurance that they will get at least some price related to the minimum support price. So if that assurance also goes, then the price will go further down. And finally, I would say that, as soon as big capital comes in, they are not going to be procuring the supplies from the small farmers. They are still going to use the traders. Maybe now fewer traders would be used, but the point is that they'll have their own big margins. If they can extract bigger margins, they would do so. They're not there for charity, so they are going to extract whatever pound of flesh they can, and therefore, the farmers are worried. And this worry of the farmers is right. The government has to assure them that they will continue to get the minimum support price, and that's what the farmers are demanding.
Absolutely, the small farmers, and as I said, this is the story of South Asia. I mean, it's also the same scenario in Pakistan. Mr. Verma, what are your thoughts about this? I mean, Professor Kumar is very clear that the farmers have a point there and they need to be assured. But it seems that the government is bent on pushing this legislation through.
Well, Professor Kumar has explained sacrosanct word by word for it. I'll rather go further from here because whatever the status quo is today needs to be resolved. And I think what will drive this entire dilemma is the two private member bills which were presented in the Lok Sabha, the Parliament of India, way back in 2018. The two private member bills, the first one was about the farmers' freedom from indebtedness, Bill 2018. And the second was the farmers' right to guaranteed remunerative minimum support price, which is MSP, for agricultural commodities, Bill 2018. Now, both these bills were presented in the Parliament, but have never been picked up. So what is going to happen is, as Professor Kumar rightly points out, that how the modus operandi is and will be, there will be slight tweaking in it, but not much. But then what will happen now, for me, is that the government shall discuss with whoever is representing these farmers on these two bills. Because bottom line, only these two bills carry the entire information that how a farmer can be protected. Doubtless, there will be middlemen. Doubtless, the private players try to benefit out of it even today, even without these legislation. However, the minimum support price in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because we depend on the monsoons for agriculture produce more or less. So here, when they go bad or the crops are bad, the MSP is the only way out for these poor and small farmers. Now, I am sure that the way forward in the coming days will be through these two bills, which are pending in 2018. Government and farmers shall discuss and probably take a step forward.
Right. Professor Kumar, is it possible, two things. One, constitutionally, I don't know what the situation in India is. Is it possible for the state governments, after this Lok Sabha legislation, to give certain guarantees in their respective states to small farmers? One. And secondly, is it possible for the government to identify or sort of, say, well, there are these small farmers, they will be treated as a special category and will be, given certain benefits and so on. I'm not very clear about how that's going to work, but I'm just throwing a thought your way to seek your view on this.
So, constitutionally, states are supposed to govern the agriculture, the commodities, and so on. There's no doubt. But the center also has a say in it. And, once the center passes some legislation, then I think states are to follow. Like, for instance, in Punjab, the state government has passed some legislation, but it's not very sure that they'll be able to apply that, and the center's, bills will stay. So, in a sense, constitutionally, I think, the problem is there that the center, whatever it does, that is what is likely to prevail. And whatever the states do is actually a bit of a show. So the opposition government the states governed by opposition can pass legislation, but I don't think that will stand. So that's why the farmers are worried. If it was so easy that the state governments could, carry the day, then the state governments would have done that and the farmers would have pressurized the state governments to do it. But that's not going to work. So I suppose it is going to happen. Secondly, the question about the small farmers. The small farmers, you cannot distinguish between the small and the big farmers. It's really what happens in the market. In the market, when the grain comes, it is from the small farmers, the big farmers, and so on. The small farmers need cash, and therefore they have to sell in the post-harvest season when the price is low. And the big farmers can hold on because they have the capital to hold on and sell when the price rises in the lean season, or they can even hold on for a little longer. So the small farmers, the problem is lack of credit. I think if better credit facilities are available to the small farmers, then they can also hold on to their produce. So in a sense, the small farmers in the market mechanism are very, very weak, and they are the ones who really suffer from this. And that's why poverty persists. Even places where the APMC markets have been removed, like in Bihar, which was done in 2005, the lot of the small farmers has not improved. They continue to remain poor, and that is because of their lack of capital. So, in a sense, it's the markets. The markets are interlinked between the produce market and the, what is called the credit market. The credit market forces the small farmers to sell their produce at cheaper prices to the traders and so on, and therefore they tend to lose out. So I think the problem lies in the structure of the markets, the agricultural markets, which are very different from other markets.
Right. Soma, that was Professor Arun Kumar speaking with us. Let me quickly go back to Mr. Nishant Verma before I wrap up. Mr. Verma, what are the worst hit states? I mean, in the sense that of agriculture, like we have Punjab, Haryana, are there any other states where the farm, which rely much on agriculture?
See, I wish to make 2 points here, if I'm allowed. First of all, Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana. These are all agriculture produce market states.
Right.
So it's not only these 2 or 3 states which are affected. But then what Professor Kumar was explaining, I'll give, that was the outcome of the produce. I will tell you what impact. He was absolutely right while pointing out that states control various agriculture produce and its marketing. But then why is the central government involved in it? We must not forget that the prices of farm inputs, such as diesel, seeds, fertilizers, insecticides, machinery, equipment, cost and prices of commissions, even if it is a private player, all these things need to come up as a paid-up cost. We also need to understand the family labor, rent of the land, depreciation of capital inputs, interest and insurance, which come up, as a cost factor for any sort of farmer in this country. So when what I underlined is these n number of things which are controlled more or less by the central government. So central government, when it comes into play and does not recognize these factors, the MSP comes into play. So states do not have that much of a say at that point in time.
Correct. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Nishant Verma speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.